Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. This past weekend, the alt-right movement held a convention in Washington, D.C., and a lot of people were protesting. And this convention was planned well ahead of the election, but this movement used this occasion to celebrate Trump's victory because that's the candidate that they supported. And I've heard a lot about this movement, so I decided to check it out for myself, to listen to one of the founders of this movement, Richard Spencer. I listened to his speech, and I'm just going to talk about it briefly and then provide my commentary about the things that he said. So during this speech, he basically was promoting this idea that somehow white people are victims. That was the main idea he was talking about how they are victims of affirmative action. He was talking about how they have a boot on their neck. He was talking about Section 8 and relocation of refugees. And he was talking about how those things are designed to break apart functional white communities. So let's talk about this for a second. Here you have a group of people, white people, who control the political process. Most of the senators are white. Most of the representatives are white. Most of the governors are white. Most of the mayors are white. These people run the political establishment. They run it. When you look at the heads of industry, who owns the major corporations in this country, those owners are white men. When you look at wealth in this country, you will see that most of the wealthy people in this country are white. When you look at the criminal justice system, you will see that white people receive shorter sentences, more lenient sentences than other groups of people. When you look at the issue of police violence in our community, you will see that black people are disproportionately targeted by the police for violence compared to white people. So you have a group of people who are dominant in this society, and that's white people. But yet this man has the nerve and the audacity to complain, to cry victim when his people are in a dominant position in this society. What the hell is he complaining about? What is he whining about? This man has the nerve to complain about being a victim when his people are the ones who have victimized people of color throughout history. How did they even come to America? How did they get the United States of America? They got it through genocide. They wiped out the native peoples, and these people like him have the nerve to complain about how they are victims. How did they build their wealth? They built their wealth off of black people, off of the backs of black people. That's how they built their wealth. They built their wealth off of the enslavement of African people. That's how they built wealth. And yet they had a nerve to complain about being victims. They also built their wealth through colonialism, taking the lands of African people and other groups of people all around the world, raping those countries of their resources and of their people. But yet this man has the audacity to complain about being a victim. There's no greater victimizer than the white man. But yet this fool wants to complain about how he's a victim. He wants to complain about how there's a boot on white people's necks when white people are the one that have their boots on everybody's neck. That speech that this man gave was filled with nothing but hatred and racism. This man was promoting the idea that white people are achievers, that white people are excellent, and that all these other people are a burden on society, essentially, that these other groups of people are despicable. He promoted all these ideas. This man was talking about a lot of things, talking about how people label white people as racist for having pride, label white people as racist for refusing to uh, accept guilt for what their ancestors have done, or labeling them as evil. Let's put it that way. Labeling them as evil for doing so. We live in a world that is all about white pride. We live in a world where you look in a magazine and all you see is a lot of white images of what it means to be handsome, what it means to be beautiful. We live in a world where you open history books and all the accomplishments of white people are highlighted, and the accomplishments of black people and other so-called minorities are de-emphasized and pushed to the margins. That's the kind of world we live in. But yet this man wants to complain about how white people are demonized for expressing pride. In a world that constantly reinforces white pride, there's not even a need for white people to talk about white pride because everything in society reinforces white pride. This man talked about refusing to accept the guilt for the sins of his ancestors. These people need to embrace the guilt of the sins of their ancestors, and they have to embrace it because they are in the position that they are in today as a result of what their ancestors did. These people are wealthy today because they stole the wealth of our labor. They are wealthy today based on that. They have privilege in society today because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So yeah, these people are guilty today because they benefit from the crimes and the atrocities of their ancestors. Now, the thing that's so frightening about this movement, but before I go to that, I just want to say this. Not only was this man espousing racism, this man also espoused anti-Semitism. He questioned whether or not Jews were even people. He referred to them as soulless golem. And he did this covertly. He didn't directly say Jews, but it was clearly and obviously implied in his statements. Clear and obviously implied. And it's important to just talk about this for a second. Not only did he make those statements, during his speech, like towards the end, he used the Nazi salute, and many people in the crowd also used the Nazi salute. The Nazi salute, a symbol of hatred, supporting a group that committed one of the worst crimes in human history, killing millions of Jews, millions of them. And this whole situation, like this whole situation where all these groups are targeted by this alt-right movement and by their candidate, Donald Trump. It just reminds me of a famous quote that I read. It's a two-part quote. One quote comes from Angela Davis where she says, if they come for me in the morning, they'll come for you at night. And then also there's this famous quote that goes like this. It says, they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. And that just reminds me of everything that's been going on with this Trump campaign. And make no mistake about it. I mean, Trump is their candidate. These people were happy. They were elated. that this man won the presidency. And they used this convention to celebrate that. So it just reminds me of what happened with Trump. He started off his campaign by condemning Mexicans, by calling them rapists and criminals. And a lot of people said, well, they didn't care about that. I'm sure a lot of people had that kind of attitude. They didn't care about it because they weren't Mexican. They said, that's just the Mexicans. That's not my business. I'm sure some of the people that made those kind of statements were probably Jewish, or probably Muslim, or probably African American. They probably thought that when they heard that statement. They said it doesn't have anything to do with me, so I don't care. And then this man went on to make derogatory statements about Muslims. And I'm sure that many of those Muslims that heard those statements were the same Muslims that said nothing or thought nothing about Donald Trump's statements about Mexicans. So he moved from Mexicans to Muslims and talked about banning Muslims from entering this country. He talked about monitoring mosques. He even talked about the idea of a special identification for Muslims. When asked about it, he seemed to be open to that idea. And his appointed chief of staff was asked about the question of whether or not it's appropriate to set up a registry for Muslims in this country. And that man would not rule it out. This is a frightening country we live in. So I'm sure that some Jews, when they heard these derogatory statements that Trump was making about Muslims, some of them said nothing. I'm sure that some of them said, well, he's not talking about Jews, so it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm sure that that's the mentality of some Jews. But I'll also note that I think the Anti-Defamation League, or one of those groups, actually did say something in response to Trump's derogatory statements about Muslims. But I'm sure that there are many Jews that probably didn't say anything about it at the time. And now Donald Trump has gotten around to the Jews. And he didn't directly speak out against Jews or anything like that. Not with his words, but with his actions he did. With his actions by appointing a man like Stephen Bannon to be his chief political strategist. That speaks volumes. Here's a man who talked about how he didn't want his children to go to a particular school because there were too many Jews there. Here's a man who is a part of this alt-right movement, a movement, as I said before, that's anti-Semitic. They appoint this guy, and that says a lot. That tells you about his priorities, and that tells you why this movement is so happy to have a man like Donald Trump in the White House. And I'm sure that a lot of people, some African Americans, for instance, seeing all these different groups being targeted by Trump and the alt-right movement, they probably didn't think much of it. Some of them didn't. In fact, some of these fools actually support Donald Trump. But don't worry, there's discrimination for black people too. Donald Trump has openly supported racial profiling. He has called for law and order instead of solutions to the problem of police brutality. He calls for law and order at a time when black people are killed every other day by these stinking police. At a time when you have all these black people being killed, from Tamir Rice to Michael Brown to Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and the list goes on and on. All these black people, Walter Scott, Rakia Boyd, all these black people killed by these police. And at that time, this man is talking about law and order, which is nothing but a code word for intense policing of black communities, harassment of black communities, oppression of black communities. See, when all these other groups were targeted by Trump and his alt-right movement, and it's his movement now, because these people embrace him, these people love him, he is their man in the White House. Each step of the way, people were silent until he got around to their group. And it's time for all these groups that are targeted by this alt-right movement and by this Trump administration, it's time for these groups to unite and work together to fight this movement and to fight this push towards racism and white supremacy in our country. As long as we live here, this is our country. As long as we're governed by the laws, the rules and regulations of this country, this is our country. So we need to fight against this hate in the White House and in the streets. Now, I just want to briefly talk about a couple of things. And the first thing is this, like, some people will say, well, Donald Trump has condemned the alt-right. He's told them to stop. Like during that 60 Minutes interview, he talked about how they should stop hating and this and that. And then he tweeted out something or made some brief one-liner statement condemning the alt-right, saying that he's disavows them and all this and that. Well, he didn't disavow them when he appointed Stephen Bannon to be the chief political strategist. He didn't disavow them when he appointed a racist, a bigot, an outright Southern cracker to be the Attorney General. Those appointments speak louder than any little brief statement he could have made condemning the alt-right. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention that. And I just want to conclude by briefly talking about the difference between the right and the left. And I'm talking about the political right and the political left. You had a situation involving Obama. We remember how Obama was harassed by the media. He was harassed by politicians and pundits because Jeremiah Wright was his pastor. People tried to associate Obama with Farrakhan. They got on Obama so hard that Obama eventually renounced his pastor who had been his pastor for like, I think it was 20 years, that Jeremiah Wright had been his pastor, and he just threw his pastor under the bus for political purposes in order to placate these people that have no love for him. No matter how much he tries to placate these people, they still hate and despise him. This man, Obama, was forced to renounce Farrakhan. Renounce Farrakhan because Farrakhan expressed support for him. Obama didn't have any problem putting on his tap dancing shoes and doing a coon show for the white media and for these white politicians. But when it comes to a Trump, not only does he brush off all these calls to condemn these movements, you know, he brushed off calls to condemn David Duke early on during the campaign. He brushed off calls to condemn the KKK who endorsed him. And he did the same with this alt-right movement, and eventually he made some little half-hearted statements. But not only did that, this man again appointed a white supremacist to be his chief political strategist. I mean, can you imagine Obama appointing Jeremiah Wright to some position in his administration? Can you imagine Obama appointing Farrakhan to some position in his administration? Of course not. You can't imagine it. Because Obama, I mean, this difference between these two movements is just like clear and obvious. It's like these right-wing nuts have conviction. These right-wing fanatics are persistent and they are determined. They don't back down. Whereas a person like Obama backs down, he's weak in that kind of way, with respect to throwing his pastor under the bus, disassociating from Farrakhan. But yet Donald Trump appoints the very person that people condemn. See, we have to be strong like these right-wing people are strong. You know, they challenged Obama when he tried to appoint a Supreme Court justice. They held up his appointment. And the justice that Obama picked is not going to go on the Supreme Court because these Republicans, these right-wing fanatics are devoted to their cause. Will the left have the same kind of devotion when Trump tries to appoint these right-wing judges? That's the question. Will they go hard in the paint the way these Republicans did? That's the question. So I just want to conclude by saying this. It's time for us to get serious about this situation. And it's just a shame that many people slept on this election. Many people did not exercise their right to vote. And then now they have the audacity to complain about Donald Trump being president and about this right-wing movement that is gaining inspiration and is being emboldened by this Trump presidency. It's time for us to organize. It's time for us to fight back. And before I go, I just want to say this. I mean, white supremacy is nothing new. You know, this alt-right movement is nothing new. It didn't start with Donald Trump, and it won't end with him. This is a part of a protracted struggle. I mean, there are plenty of examples of politicians who were Klansmen. Plenty of examples of sheriffs, mayors, governors, senators, congresspeople, and even presidents of the United States were members of the KKK. So this mix of white supremacy with political power is nothing new. And outright white supremacy is one form of oppression that we have to worry about, but also some of the most oppressive institutions carry out their will without being overtly racist, without being overtly affiliated with the Klan or any other white supremacist group. A prime example of that is just the criminal justice system, a system that has incarcerated Black people in mass numbers, a system that gives us the most harsh sentences compared to others. When we look at the educational system and the disparities there, and I could go on and on. My point is this alt-right movement is nothing new. Racism is nothing new. This is just a continuation of our struggle here in this country. And it's time for us to get organized, to get involved, and to make a difference in our communities. Peace.